Got it. Hey, what's up? I'm finally back home again here in Thailand. Spent about 10 weeks now with the X-H2S, traveling Europe and Indonesia. Lots of great stuff there coming up on this channel. But I was constantly messing around with my camera settings because, well, in a run and gun shooting environment, everything has to work quick and smooth because sometimes something comes up and you don't have time to set up your camera to get the shot. And I think I got it right finally. So I would say let's start with the button layout. Let's start with the basic buttons. I have my aperture set here in the front. Of course, when I use lenses that have an aperture ring such as the 16 to 55mm, then I use the aperture ring for that. See, I'm using the Tamron 70 to 70 now. I actually shot all the time during those 10 weeks with the 16 to 55, but I sold it because I found that the 17 to 70 is just more travel friendly. But anyway, so if I use a lens like that, then I use the front dial to set my aperture and then my back dial for shutter speed. And I personally left the ISO just on the ISO button. I don't use any dials for that because I don't really change my ISO that often. Usually I stick to base ISO and only when it gets into low light then I really change it, but it's like a one-time change and it just stays as it is. And I also set the shutter button to record because I don't want to use this small button here when I'm in video mode, and I can use it for something else. It's actually my special button that I will come to in a minute. And there's also the small button here in between the grip and the lens, which I set to fix movie crop magnification or however it's called in the menu, and that gives you a 1.38x crop. I think it makes a lot of sense to have this feature on this button here because your middle finger is always there, and with just one press you're a bit closer to your subject, which is especially good when you use a lens such as the Viltrox 13mm 1.4. So you can use super wide for vlogging, but if you want to be a bit closer to your subject, you can also do that with the press of a button, and it's easy to find because it's on your finger anyway. And on the front side there's also the small button here, which is usually switching the focus mode, but I switch my focus mode so often that I don't want to have that on this button, so I switched that to zebra setting because I don't use my zebra that often, and in a few cases where I use it, it's fine for me to use my left hand to change that setting. But let's now talk more about my focus settings here, because that is actually where it's really important to set up the X-H2S in the right way, because that is where you usually waste a lot of time if you set it up wrong. I ended up using the 4 buttons around the menu button for all of my focusing settings, so I have everything in one place. There's one exception, I will come to that soon, and the right button is there to set the focus mode, so basically switching between manual focus, AFC and AFS, and then I set the left button to area or multi, and then when I press up, this is face detection on or off, and when I press down, that's subject detection on or off. So that is also something when you shoot travel videos, it's like all the time you have to change that. And then in the quick menu, I've set the first editable point, which is the first point to the right, to subject detection setting. It's actually the only thing that I really use in my quick menu because, I don't know, all the other stuff already goes so quick. The quick menu doesn't really speed it up anymore for me. So that is the only setting there. And here's the one exception to my focus buttons, which is that I set the AF lock functionality to the record button. That was a game changer for me because before I always switched it to manual focus to be able to leave the focus somewhere where it is, and for that you need 3 button clicks. You have to press the focus mode button, then you have to choose the focus mode that you want to have, manual focus usually or AFC, then you have to confirm that with OK. And it's 3 button clicks and the subject is gone or whatever you wanted to film, so that doesn't work. But with a click of the AF L button, you can just leave it in autofocus, and just with a click of one button, the focus stays exactly where it is, doesn't move anymore. Big game changer for me. There's one button that I forgot, that is the AEL button, and I set this button to view assist on and off because I shoot in f-log 2 all the time, and sometimes you're not really sure if your shadows are too dark or not, if there's still detail in there. Then it's good to be able to quickly turn the view assist feature off, that you see if the detail in the shadow is still there or not. That's my button layout, and I'm really happy with that. There's one great feature on this camera, also the custom modes, C1 to C7. So let me quickly show you how I set that up before we actually go into the menus. And there it's actually very simple. I have C1 to 24 frames per second, C2 to 60 frames per second, and C3 to 120 frames per second, or slow motion, high speed mode in that camera. And then you find also C4, C5 and C6. and I've set that to film simulations on. So if I want to vlog or something where I just want to shoot everything a bit quicker, I don't want to do color grading in post and so on, then I also have C4 to 24 frames per second just with film simulation. I use classic Chrome, then C5 60 frames per second with film simulation, and C6 120 frames per second with film simulation, all in 4K by the way. And C7 is my photo mode. I've also set it to classic Chrome there. I will show you the settings in a second. And yeah, so every time I want to shoot photos, I just go to C7. So that's my custom profiles. It's time to go into the menu now. Shooting mode is always manual for me, except when I shoot time lapses, then I oftentimes use aperture priority, and otherwise I never use any other mode, even when I'm vlogging by the way. Maybe sometimes if I have a shot where I go from inside to outside, then I would also use either aperture priority or shutter priority. Movie mode, I shoot everything in DCI 17:9. I just like to have this little bit wider aspect ratio. I think it's a good middle ground between using cinematic bars or the 21:9 aspect ratio and 16:9. I find 16:9 still a little bit too high. Yeah, I'm not into vertical video at all. I don't like that. I also don't like short form content, to be honest. So for me, it's always super wide in DCI. And I've set my frame rate here to 23.98, but that depends on the custom profile. As mentioned before on C2, that's 60 frames per second or 59.94, and 120 frames per second or whatever number that is in the C3 profile. And when you go a bit lower, high speed rec, that is what you have to turn on for your slow motion or 120 frames per second preset. So that is what I use in my C3 profile. But back to C1 again, the next important setting is the media rec setting. I use slot 1 here because I'm shooting on a CFast Express Type B card. Let's now actually go into the menu point, and here you see media rec settings 1, and I shoot everything in ProRes 4:2 MOV because I don't want my files to be too big, but I still want to have a decent quality. However, if you want to save some space in ProRes, you can also shoot ProRes LT. It's still a really good quality. I shot a whole wedding in ProRes LT a few years ago on the Atomos Ninja V, and I could see it in a few shots, maybe 2 or 3 shots or so, but most of the time it was perfectly fine and the client was very happy with the result, so no worries about that. But if you want to go really small with your file size, what I for example do right now when recording my A-roll, where the file size would actually be way too big, then I also choose another format here. Then I choose H.265 Longop 4:2, and I actually choose only 100 megabit per second because that's the codec that I already used on my Sony cameras before, and it was perfectly fine. Never had any issues really with the video quality, and I actually found that on the Fuji it's even slightly better in that format. Also, when you're vlogging in Vlog and you want this 10-bit, you don't necessarily have to use ProRes, you can also use that. The insane thing is that I get 21 hours of recording time on that 1 terabyte card in this format. Or if you want to have an even smoother editing experience, then you can choose the H.265 All-I 4:2 codec and select either 360 Mbits or 720 Mbits, because All-I means that the video file actually saves every single frame, while Longop means that it only saves every 8th frame, and in between those keyframes it saves only the differences between those frames. This is actually where all the compression comes from, and especially if you want to speed clips up in post. If you want to make a hyperlapse or something similar, for example, then your computer in a Longop format would have to decode all frames basically, because it doesn't save every single frame. But in the All-I codec, it can basically skip all the frames that are not needed when you speed up the video. That is actually what ProRes files do as well. They also save every single frame, which is one of the reasons why it's so easy to edit this format. I would still say that ProRes is much easier to edit even on my M1 Max, but especially on older computers. So try it out for yourself, but generally that All-I compression does a bit better as well. It's kind of the middle ground between H.265 Longop and ProRes. I hope I didn't make it too complicated to understand all this codec stuff, or it was too much information. What I generally would recommend for most people is to just shoot an H.265 with 100 Mbits, 10-bit 4:2, because there you get a really good quality still and really small file sizes. But you need a good computer such as the new M1 Max to be able to edit that. Otherwise, better ProRes or the H.264 profiles. So just to make it a bit easier here at the end of this part. But now let's go a bit down in the menu, and there you see the F-Log HLG recording. And in my C1, C2 and C3 profiles, I have that set to F-Log 2 because that gives you the maximum of dynamic range from this camera, and it's really good for color grading. I will do another tutorial soon about F-Log 2, how to expose that and how to color grade it and so on. So subscribe for that, and let's go further down in the menu. There you also have data level setting, and that's important when you shoot ProRes. According to Gerald Undan, you have to set it to video range if you shoot in ProRes, but full range if you shoot in the other codecs. So just important to remember that here, otherwise you might get wrong colors. And then IS mode, I actually shoot all of my videos only in IBIS OIS. I never turn digital image stabilization on or anything like that. So I would suggest you the same. Digital image stabilization just adds another crop and so on. I don't really want that, and I figured out that the normal inbuilt stabilization, especially combined with optical image stabilization from one of their lenses, even the Tamron 17-70, does a really good job. So no reason to change that. I would also not turn that off, to be honest, except when on a tripod or a gimbal. And also IS mode boost, I never use that in any of my videos, you don't need that. ISO in F-Log 2, the minimum is 1250, so you want to use something like that, a variable ND filter. The stronger the better, because that ISO level is a lot, and if you shoot outside in bright daylight and open aperture, you need to darken the image, otherwise it's not possible to expose right. And zebra setting, as mentioned, I assigned that to a button, and zebra level is 85% here because F-Log 2 clips at 85% IRE on your histogram. Now, the reason why that clips at 85%, or why the highlights end at 85% and not at 100%, is that it can probably save even more dynamic range than it does on this camera. I think they did that to reserve for future cameras. Usually manufacturers do that to make the footage of a certain camera easier to match with their cinema line. Panasonic, for example, does that with their V-Log L and V-Log profiles on cinema cameras, and on the GH cameras that's called V-Log L. That also clips a bit earlier. That could mean that we will see another camera from Fujifilm sooner or later, maybe a cinema camera, maybe a GFX flagship that has like 16 stops of dynamic range or something like that. It would be awesome. But yeah, it's not out yet, but it suggests that we will see something like that in the future. Hopefully, I can never have enough dynamic range. So much about Zebra, 85% for F-Log 2, I think 95% for F-Log, and for film simulation, I would just keep that at 100%. If you want to use Zebra level, it just indicates you where your highlights clip, so you are sure that you don't overexpose parts of your image that you don't want to overexpose. But yeah, further down, movie optimized control. I personally don't need it, so I have it turned off. I think what it does is that you always control the aperture with your front dial, but as mentioned in the beginning, when I have a lens on it that has an aperture dial, I want to use this dial and not that, so I just kept it off. But well, if you always want to control the aperture with that dial, then just turn it on. Telelight, it's actually a really nice feature of this camera. I've set that to front and rear constantly being on while I'm recording, so what that means is, I can show you that quickly. I press the record button, see here in the front, that light turns on, and also here in the back that also turns on, and that indicates me that I'm recording. So for example, here in my studio now, I am always sure that this camera records, and I don't want to set it to the blinking feature, because maybe you could see that in my face or in any other subject when the light blinks. Then I would rather have a constant light that adds a little bit more light to my face or so than having it blinking, otherwise it could be a little bit weird. So that's why I chose this setting, but this is a nice feature about this camera. I wish more cameras would have that, so you can be sure that it's actually recording always. And if we go into the next section, IQ settings, there are actually not many points available because I shoot in F-Log 2, but here I set the sharpness to -4 and the high ISO noise reduction also to -4, because I don't want in-camera noise reduction, and I also don't want any in-camera sharpening. To be honest, this camera, even at sharpness -4, is still really sharp. I wish we could reduce that even more, but yeah, not too bad there. Definitely set it to -4 and not higher. And aside from that, the rest, interframe noise reduction also off, and peripheral light correction, I don't even know what that is, so I left that off as well. If you don't shoot in F-Log 2 or F-Log, then you have more options in this IQ menu available. So at first you can choose your film simulation. The one that I love the most is Classic Chrome, but also Eterna is good if you want to have a bit more dynamic range especially. And on rainy days, EB or Eterna Bleach Bypass is just an amazing profile. It actually makes fun shooting in the rain when you use that. And white balance, yeah, just set it however your situation is. Dynamic range, I recently did a vlog test where I wanted to see if I really need to color grade my Fujifilm footage or not, where I used dynamic range 400 still, but I wasn't really that happy with the footage because it gets too noisy in video mode. In photo mode, the dynamic range 400 setting is fine, but for video mode, I don't like it, so I keep my dynamic range setting here to 100. And the tone curve, I have it set to -2 for the highlights and -2 for the shadows, what essentially makes the image a little bit flatter, so you get a bit more dynamic range still despite using the dynamic range 100 setting. Color, I keep that at 0, and sharpness and noise reduction, etc. the same as in F-Log, all to -4. I must actually say, in the film simulation, it looks a bit softer to me than in F-Log. So I don't know what's going on there, if Fuji does that purposefully or not, but if they would also give us a bit less sharpness in F-Log, that would be great. And next menu point, Afmf. I mean, I don't actually have to say much here because I have it assigned all to my buttons, but what might be interesting for you is AFC settings, and it depends a little bit on the lens. When I was shooting with the 16 to 55mm lens from Fuji, I kept the sensitivity to 3 because I figured out that it started hunting around a bit too quickly, and the AF speed to -3 there to make the focus transitioning a bit slower when it transitions between subjects. But it really depends on the lens. For example, on the Viltrox 13mm 1.4, I use +2 and -2 instead of +3 and -3. So that's like really playing a bit around with different lenses that you use to find your right settings there. Let's go into microphone or audio settings. And the internal mic adjustment, I just set it to +-0 decibel. I think that's the standard setting. And external mic level adjustment to -30 decibels. That's what you want to do with all of your cameras. Always set it to the lowest. That still records audio. Like I think on Sony, if you set it to the lowest, it did not record audio anymore. So that's like one step higher. But here you can set it to -30 decibels on the Fuji, because then in case the preamps in the camera would give you a bit of noise, that's greatly reduced, so you don't get that. And I must actually say at -30 decibels with the Rode VideoMic NTG that I'm using right now, or also the DJI mic, I get really good results. Mic jack setting obviously to mic, because we're using microphones and not anything else. Mic level limiter, I turned that on just in case sometimes my audio should clip on the microphone side or so it's not completely distorted anymore. Doesn't do that much in camera. You could turn it off as well, but maybe it helps sometimes, so I just left that on. Wind filter off, it just makes your audio bad. Low cut filter off because I used that in my microphone already. Headphones volume, that's up to you. And yeah, timecode, I don't use timecode, so I also don't change anything there. Okay, so much about the settings of this camera. If you need to know more about the X-H2S, especially how to expose and color grade F-Log, I will publish a video about that soon, so subscribe and I will link that video here in the corner, then you will find that directly. Aside from that, I also reviewed this camera a few months ago. I will add another review soon with a long-term experience, but you will find the initial review already here, and I will also replace that with the new review as soon as it's out. Yeah, I hope to see you in those videos.